There we go. So this is the second installment of the Microsoft Data Platform Continuity Virtual Group Meeting for December of 2021. With me are some absolutely amazing industry experts. And what we're going to do is we're just simply going to open the floor to questions for everybody here. And if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, don't just think that your questions are going to go unanswered. Please reach out to us. Let us know what questions you have. If there are any questions at all, we will, I'll make sure that we answer them. If they're really good questions, we're going to do this again, probably quarterly, give or take. And I'd love to have you re-ask the question there, or maybe I'll just ask it for you if it's something that a lot of people need to know about. So with that, the first question that I have is, take an availability group, cluster-based. What are the things that you find that can disrupt the cluster or the availability group enough to take the whole thing down? And anybody
I'll go
can start
first
there.
if you
Go for it.
want.
Yeah, go for it.
VM snapshots.
Yep. If the VM snapshot is taking forever to take or to roll, basically delete it. Yeah, absolutely. Then you can run really slow. And if anybody leaves snapshots out there, then I'm gonna have to have a word with you. So don't do that.
On my end, I would answer that with wrong network settings, so that the switches decide it's a great idea to disconnect all the machines.
That's helpful.
Yep. And so that's something that can easily happen.
I think I'd say a networking team that thinks they can outsmart the normal operations of that stuff. I've certainly had that experience where they're like, well, we don't like the way SQL Server and Windows manage this, so we've scripted our own like extra failover goodness, which is rarely goodness. It's one of those things, like the DBAs and the networking and operations folks are on the same team. So if they're going rogue or if we are, it's going to end in tears eventually.
Probably the most horrifying one that I've ever run across was at a DR site, and one of the junior networking folks actually unplugged the networking switch.
Oops.
So my situation doesn't necessarily bring the AG down, but it can make it painful when you have an AG in Azure and you have a poorly written workload that starts banging up against the VM IO limits. Make some interesting things happen.
Yeah, throttling of any kind is never fun.
Another one that would come to mind is on the very other end of spectrum. So we mostly listed so far hardware or environmental or infrastructure things. What comes in mind is what's really good is sometimes when you hit the bug in SQL Server that Microsoft left behind, and that bug gets nicely replicated to all the instances and crashes them at the same time in the replay.
Oops. That's an even bigger oops.
How can you corrupt n databases at the same time?
Wow. In your world, 1,000 different ways, but everybody else, it's very carefully.
Kind of along similar lines. I did have a junior networking or ops person once run the cluster validation wizard underneath a production cluster and choose to validate storage, which will briefly offline volumes. So that was a fun hotline phone call where it's like, we didn't touch storage, and then some yelling, possible swearing ensued, and it's like, well, we did do this. Yeah, don't do that. So that's why, it seems innocent, right? And so and this person was new, like it wasn't really their fault, they were told to do it, but it seems like, well, I want to validate that to make sure it works. Sure. But you need to know the impact from that, and they did not. And then we all learned together.
Variation of that is if you add a new node to the cluster and tell the new node it's now the cluster has shared volumes instead of not shared volumes. When you forget the node disk at the PowerShell command, and then all the other ones disconnect because this one wants them exclusively. Yep, it's a variation, but as evil.
Wow.
Or when you're having cooling problems in your data center.
Well, you have
And
bigger problems than just an AG going down at that
right.
point.
But in specific, you'll appreciate this. And your team lead plugs the Robbie the Robot emergency air cooler into the PDU that has the storage head on it.
Ouch.
It could have been worse.
Triple
They could
circuit
have
breaker.
misted water onto the servers to cool them down. That's pretty good though.
There's simply not enough Advil for that situation.
That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part is that it was a school district we were working in had purchased cooling units in Ohio that were only rated to work into 5 degrees above zero, and it was 15 degrees below zero outside that day.
Wow.
Good grief.
Wonder if that qualifies as oops.
Yeah, I think that goes all the way to don't.
Yeah, it's like dropping a metal wrench inside your UPS.
Not
And then
good.
trying
It's
to
bright,
pick it up.
it's for a very brief moment, it's very bright.
Wow.
And then it gets very dark. A very long time.
Now I say this because we've got a client emergency that's been ongoing for the last week. We're getting some very interesting scenarios where the failover cluster itself simply loses communication with the other replicas. And officially nothing has changed. And what we're trying to figure out, is it I've personally seen antivirus and security solutions that will see network traffic and just randomly elect to kill them. I have seen things like virtual machine level snapshots. There's a lot of things out there that can cause these hiccups. And and actually the funny thing is, starting in January, I'm actually going to be pinging everybody here to do some basic recording. I want to hear your war stories, and we all have some good ones. So this will be a lot of fun, especially based on what I just heard. These are going to be good. Cool. We got a good question here. When is the complexity of a failover cluster instance more beneficial than an availability group architecture?
I think a lot of times, if your staff doesn't have any experience with AGs, once you get an FCI set up, it's so easy to administer and just add more databases. And I recommend it for a lot of people who don't have experience with AGs, even though it's quote old fashioned. But
Yeah, the only time it's old fashioned is when it's deprecated, in my opinion. It's still a very viable technology. Anybody else want to chime in? Uh-oh. TG, okay, you're chomping at the bit there. Go for it.
Nah. I have to disagree. FCIs introduce more failure than they help. It's the main problem is an FCI is technically more complex than an AG to manage. It needs less discipline because you don't have to worry about like creating a login on both nodes. But from a failure perspective, FCI has way more horrible ways of failing than an AG has. And with an AG, if one side fails, the other side usually has still a copy of the database that you can use. With an FCI, in many cases, when it fails, there is no copy left. And for example, my thing is, most FCIs are 2-node FCIs. So they need some kind of tiebreaker. And then people choose to use the old good quorum devices to use as a tiebreaker, because thing is, and then just imagine SQL runs on node 1, tiebreaker quorum device runs on node 2, and you lose network connectivity between the two. Your SQL is down and it's not coming up. Or if node 2 loses network connectivity, you can't come up because it will fail over to the node where SQL is not running, which is the one that is inaccessible, stuff like this. Yeah. So there's some things. Yeah. I agree. It's much easier to maintain. You need less discipline because you have to just maintain one system. But that's also, in my opinion, the downside. You have one system. If you mess it up on one node, failing it over to the other node doesn't help you.
Yeah,
So-
well, that's why you would combine it with something like log shipping, maybe to another, to get around that single point of failure. But yeah, not everybody's like your complex environment.
Yeah, it's,
Well,
Way back,
and I'll throw in
when,
a somewhat snarky comment. I would say that the complexity of an FCI is more beneficial than an AG if you're running a SQL version prior to 2012. However, there's a bunch of snark in that because there weren't AGs back then.
And technically, you shouldn't be running those now.
Unfortunately, since I'm right in the midst of migrating one of those, I would agree with you very wholeheartedly.
I'm certain that there are several of us on this call that have at least one version that is no longer supported, or clients that have at least one version that is no longer supported. Hence the preface of technically.
Yes.
for the first time in my life, that is not the case since about
Oh,
9
you're
months
lucky
ago.
man.
Every company before the current one I've worked for, there was old stuff. This one, nope. Everything is current. And
I
with
wouldn't-
current, I mean on the last released version.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
would not know
Nice.
how that feels.
I've still on I don't have a single if statement in my maintenance code that deals with old versions anymore.
Wow.
You lucky soul.
Yeah,
No
I
kidding.
have no idea how they made it happen. That guy deserves like an Oscar on top of a Golden Globe for that.
Or at least a Purple Heart.
Yeah.
And a good
I get
It also includes luck that all the third-party software is actually capable of doing that, because
Wow.
that's usually the main reason you have one of these old guys around, not because you're
almost
own
always.
developers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I gave a session back in October, and it's a session I've given semi-frequently over the years. I always ask the same thing. And so in October of 2021 was the first time I'd asked, is anybody running SQL Server 2005? And nobody raised their hand.
Mm.
So there's some legacy stuff out there for sure. But at that particular event in October, there was one person running 2008.
Mhm.
Everybody else was 2012 and up. So baby
I know-
steps, right?
I know a company that runs a 6.5.
Mhm.
Wow.
I know.
Have you
I
ever
also-
wondered why, when you go into MSDN,
Mhm.
that you can still download 6.5? Because technically 6.5 with a very, very expensive agreement is still supported.
I'm just imagining that the room that server lives in, there's like this old wizard guy, and just he cares for the server, and that's it. And
until recently, that guy looked like Thomas.
Nope, I have never worked for them, but I know that case, and they have it running on a VM because you can't run it on any physical box anymore. The CPUs just are not compatible anymore. The Windows NT4, for whatever reason, doesn't run on on a CPU that was built 20 years later.
Really?
Yep, we actually have a customer running 6.5 on NT4 in a VM. It's for a door security system, the whole RFID thing, completely proprietary. And every single time it communicates with the database, the very first thing it does is send select that version. If it's not 6.5, it shuts down.
Wow.
Yeah, and it would cost them too much to replace this system campus wide. So they pay for the support, and nobody sneezes around that thing. And they've got about 800 copies of this VM floating around just in case. And they just let it run, and it does its job, and nobody says anything.
That brings
So-
up a really good point around the idea that as you look at these extremely old versions that are out there for business reasons that are convoluted but make in some way, shape, or form sense, it brings some really heavy HADR questions to it, like needing to have 800 copies of the VM around.
Well, it goes beyond that. I mean, we've got one company that we work with. They are heavily FDA regulated. So the vast majority of their systems, believe it or not, are still 2008, and they have a handful of 2005 out there. And they have to certify with the manufacturers of the software and internally, and we're talking thousands of pages of manual documentation, everything surrounding these systems before they can even think about doing an upgrade.
Whoa.
And most of the time, it is 5 to 10 years after a SQL Server release before they get the okay to actually go ahead and do an upgrade. You know, it's frightening. You know, there are security implications, there's high availability challenges. You know, disaster recovery is arguably easier because they're all VMs at this point, but it's still an absolute nightmare.
There's a couple of new questions in chat, and both
Yeah.
of them intrigue me.
Yeah. So there's the next one here for tier 2 systems. What are your thoughts on the best continuity architecture when a recovery time objective is greater than 1 hour? That's a good one.
It was the easiest way I could say AG is probably not the first choice.
Well, depends on. So in addition to the RTO being greater than 1 hour, what is the RPO, recovery point objective?
RPO would be 15 minutes. You would still have the 15 minutes. So you're still taking translog backups every 15.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that part of the recovery can't be I'm restoring from backup to get to that RPO.
Okay, I'll open the floor on that one. That's good.
But when you have an RPO of 15 minutes, taking log backups every 15 minutes is not enough, because that gives you an RPO just above 15 minutes, because you need to consider the time the backup takes in consideration when you do it every 15 minutes. So that usually gives you like 16, 17 minutes.
And if one fails.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. So I would do like 5-minute backups, which are also easier and not as big. And then, if I have more than an hour to get it back on and there's not too many of them, I would go with regular log shipping. It's in there, it's there for years. It works, and it solves 2 problems. You need to take backups anyway, and you test your backups on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
I'll throw
it's
the
completely
caveat.
free. You don't need any special something. It's there. Just have some script that once a day or so make sure that all the configuration, logins, all that is in sync, and you will have a happy life.
So I'll throw one caveat to that to see if it changes your answer. If you do not have control of the backups, and when I say that, meaning that the business as a whole has said we are using a third party,
Then
for argument's sake, Veeam.
then
Yeah.
Then make sure that in your contract you are not liable for anything that requires recovery when you are not in control of your backups.
Yep.
I would quit the job, honestly.
Yeah, if they won't listen to you and let you do native backups, then you got a problem.
I need somebody to give me a document that I can throw in front of my boss then, because we're paying for Veeam. We should use it for SQL is the argument.
Well, here's the use case for this. I don't have a doc for this, but take Veeam today and say, literally tomorrow, pick up the phone and say, we have had an issue. I need you to recover this database as a new database on this instance to 2:47 p.m. local time. Go. If they can't do an in-between recovery there and do it now, then it doesn't meet your needs.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
That's your
They
ammunition.
can do it. They can do it though. That's the thing. I had to do it this week. We did it. Somebody did an oops delete records in prod, did a restore, and I was able to do it. Hold on. Sorry, I may have answered incorrectly. I was able to do a restore to a minute, down to a minute, but it was their selectable minute.
So therefore,
I'll
it's
say
not
it that
good
way.
enough because you couldn't go to the microsecond before that delete occurred. So
You
what
potentially
happened? What
lost other
happened?
data.
Yeah. The business has now lost data, which may or may not be within the SLAs. And if it is, then physically write a letter stating your recovery objectives are this. Your chosen backup solution against my better judgment will give you this granularity. Please physically sign here to state that I'm not liable for any data loss if it does not meet any of these things down the road.
Fair enough.
It's a CYA thing. It doesn't help the business very much, but it's better than nothing.
Fair enough.
Yeah, you're at least getting them to acknowledge that they know, and that at least for right now, they're not going to come yelling at you in your office because of it. Now, whether they don't like it or not is a different story. And then you could say, okay, well, if you don't like it, then let me help you with some options.
Yeah,
So-
we
so-
say, here are my concerns and here are the alternatives that you have that complement what you're already doing, but can give you additional granularity and flexibility.
Fair enough.
I'm
Just
not
to give,
I'm not morally opposed to Veeam, but I like Veeam as a plan B. I like plan A being your native SQL Server backups, accompanied by like maybe daily VM snapshots. Such that if you were to have some sort of failure and you needed to use Veeam as your plan B, then that's great. But Veeam as a primary makes me a little nervous.
No, it's one of those things they just recently introduced. I don't want to pick on Veeam directly. I'll just say they recently introduced SQL Server VDI functionality for backups.
Yeah.
So if you have a defined SLA for both planned and unplanned outages and recoverability options, and if Veeam as tested, not as documented, is able to meet or exceed those, and you test it frequently, it could be good enough. I am morally opposed to it because if I need to recover a database, I generally don't have the time or want to involve another team. Plus the Veeam restore process may take longer than your RPOs or RTOs, but it could be good enough with excessive amounts of testing.
Comes down to
I had
testing, document it.
Yeah, I had a scenario with third-party vendor backup software where there was an odd mix of native backups and third-party in the environment. And then I also discovered that those two things were happening on the same machine. So I went to my system administrators and I said, we have to pick one. And I think before we even got to that point, we actually did need to recover a database. And what we had available was the third party. And it wasn't recovery, it was drop and reattach. I was attaching files, not what we would all know as recovery. I said, so then I had to explain to them why that's not a good idea either.
Yeah, it all goes back to the defined SLAs. And if you can demonstrate, that it actually meets or exceeds what they have said, document the caveats, document the nuances, sign off that it's not your preferred choice, but you're going to go with it, and validate the heck out of it periodically. Do you have a couple other good questions here?
If I could interject too.
Yeah, go for it.
There's the old axiom that we don't do backup because we like backup. We do backup because we like recovery. And so if recovery testing isn't a part of your regular team processes, definitely make it part of the processes. Having been an enterprise DBA in my past, we got burned by the SLAs that we signed and things like that without really knowing what our true capabilities were. And so we learned from that. And one of the things that we learned is if we make a promise, we better do drills, real life drills, just like EMTs and firefighters, first responders, soldiers. They all drill because when it gets really scary, you start to make mistakes. You start to get worried and anxious. So if you haven't actually gone through the process of making a recovery test or drill part of your process, we moved that to twice a year, first half, second half of the year kind of process for our big production systems. It was a massive lesson learned. And it really was empowering for us as well as a team, because we could very authoritatively say when things went bad, we could say, oh, it's going to take us 45 minutes to get it back up. And we knew, because we had recently tested, that that's the real deal. That's what it's going to take for us to get it back up. I kind of felt like Scotty on the Starship Enterprise, you know, and they're like, how do you know, Scotty, that it'll get back up? The book says this and such. And Scotty got to say, I wrote that book. So you will never know unless you actually do a full test.
And test frequently. You know, it's one of those things. If you don't test your restores, you have nothing but a paperweight and a space heater.
Yeah, and make it very clear that there's the big difference if you have to recover one database,
yes,
or all of them.
Yep.
Yes, you might be able to do one in 45 minutes. You will not be able to do a couple of hundred in 45 minutes. You can't type that fast.
Which
also saturate your link in your storage to the box that you're trying to restore to.
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah, at some point, even if you automate it, you will reach a limit that. Yeah. But
you're going to overrun some piece of hardware at some point.
Also, never forget, if you are paranoid and you encrypt your databases and all that stuff, make sure you have backups of all the certificates and encryption keys and everything, because the best backup is worthless if it's encrypted and you can't decrypt it.
And make sure those are not on the same backup subsystem, aka a disaster this morning where the storms that went through yesterday knocked an entire site offline and their password vault was offline, so nobody could turn anything on.
You'd be surprised at how many times I get asked by customers, do you guys manage the encryption keys for SQL Server databases? And I'm like, no. And you shouldn't be putting your keys on the Rubrik appliance because your backups are there. Go put them someplace else.
Yep.
Worst case, print them and put them in a safe. It's miserable to type, but it works.
It does work. You know, there are very good low-tech solutions to high-tech problems, and that is one of them.
Yeah, trust me, typing a 4,000 letter key, which might take you an hour, is still better than not having the key at all.
Print it out as a barcode. Print it out as a barcode, and then you just scan it. You don't have to type 4,000.
Yeah.
But with all those things, as we're talking about typing 4,000 characters or thinking about, you know, how many databases we have to restore in a given amount of time, even if they're automated, understand when your SLAs start. Do they start when the system went down, or do they start when you have a viable instance of SQL Server to start recovering to?
Especially in a highly siloed organization, if you as a DBA don't have any privileges to spin up a new server, you know, you could have the clock ticking on you, and yet you're completely unable to respond until, say, the sysadministration team comes online and gets a new server set up and provisioned for you.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they've given me access to Veeam, so I can do some of the manipulation I need to, but the hands are still tied. Like, I'm not standing a VM up. I can add RAM in a pinch if I need to, but again, I'm not doing the spin ups like you're talking about. So
Yeah.
thank you, everybody, by the way.
Mhm. It's got a really thought-provoking question here. When people spend time in these broad SQL Server discussion forums, it seems that availability group setup and configuration questions and thoughts are everywhere. Why do you think this is the case? Is it that there's just so many options and permutations of this? Or is the documentation complete online? You know, why do we think there's just so many recommendations and thoughts and questions on this stuff?
My take would be it's the biggest problem with availability groups, and to a degree FCI as well, is that the key part of the configuration is outside of SQL Server.
Hmm.
The underlying cluster must be working the way you expect it to work. The problem is if you just set it up, it's most likely not working the way you want it to work when something fails. Yeah, things like majorities, and you shut down one node and suddenly you wonder why the other node goes down, because 1 out of 2 is not a majority. 1 out of 2 is exactly half if it's less than more than half. And things like this. So a lot of the configuration of of an AG is outside of SQL Server. And to make it easy, you need the SQL Server service account needs a lot of permissions inside Active Directory and the Windows Server to maintain or easily add new AGs, new listeners, and all that. And in many places, the Windows and the SQL are separated in different teams that often don't even have the same boss. So you have to like talk to a different division almost in the company. And that's a part that makes it hard.
Well, in
Yeah.
smaller companies where they may be under the same boss, they may not have the experience with the clustering component. That's what I ran into at my place.
Yeah.
The SQL part's easy. The clustering is the nightmare.
Yeah, Josh, I was just going to comment about that. So as the person on this call with the least experience, the least broad experience, and I've worked at smaller companies like you just mentioned, the DBA often has this, they know about this great technology. They read about availability groups and they think, yes, let's do that because it meets the situation, whatever that is. They feel confident that that's the solution. But then they start talking to their system administrators and their network folks, and those people have never set up a cluster before. And so now the DBA is trying to educate the rest of the team, whether that's one person or 10, on how this all works. So then they're forced to become, better at understanding the wider technology, which is good, but it makes it burdensome to get it in place. And I think that's part of why there are questions. Because you have someone like me who's trying to explain to somebody who's been a system administrator for 10 years, but's never done a cluster, why they should and how, what to watch out for. So then I have to go do a bunch of Googling so I can answer those questions myself.
And let's not forget the additional layer of complexity that gets added for a small shop in particular if you're virtualized. It's another layer to deal with. And historically, VMware and clusters in particular have not exactly played well together.
Could you talk about that a little bit more, Peter?
The couple times that I've tried to set up just like a failover cluster in VMware, it's been a little bit since I last tried to do it because I don't play in VMware very much anymore. I believe it needed raw disk mappings the last time I did it, and those added some complexity from a failover perspective for the VM team and they just didn't want to deal with it, yet we were being told we had to use failover clusters for HA.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's one reason I couldn't do clustering, because we talking about RDMs, which I had to ask, what is that? And once they explained it to me and I did some research and we talked about it, they were just like, no, we're not going to do that. RDMs and VMware suck. We don't want to manage that. So then we actually ended up doing AGs because they didn't have to do that sort of thing. A lot of system administrators complain about the double use of storage. Like, you're doubling my storage. And I'll say, yes, but I'm also ensuring that you're going to stay up.
Also, layering two technologies that do the exact same thing on top of each other usually doesn't go well, because VMs technically are a failover cluster instance. You have the VM that either runs on the VM host 1 or VM host 2 if the one dies. Yeah? So they already have an FCI built in, and now you try to put another one of them on top, And the moment you layer high availability technologies, you have to be very careful because they don't play well with each other. They can,
No, they
but
can.
instead of a simple these three checkbox setup, it becomes a 200-page checkbox list that you have to tick off because everything has to, then you have to change timings. I've seen so many people trying to put an availability group on top of two failover clusters, not realizing that every time they fail over one of the clusters, the AG will fail over as well, because the failover cluster in its name has fail. So it shuts down the service. AG detects that and says, I run on the other side. Yeah. And then, yeah. So it's, and the same is with failover cluster inside a VM cluster, a VMware cluster. Yeah. It's the same thing. It's two technologies that try to do the same. And when you're not super careful and know each and every bit what's necessary, they will fight each other when push comes to shove and you need something very wrong.
Tooth and nail.
So it's better if you're already on VMware. I don't think adding an failover cluster does much for high availability.
They're complementary in a small subset of everything.
Yeah.
And I would claim it's more at that point for extended planned outages than it is for unplanned scenarios.
Yeah.
Okay, and just an observation that applies to both failover cluster instances and AGs. But if you're in a virtual environment, find out what anti-affinity means. Because if you don't have it,
Yes.
Yeah, to translate that for everybody that might be listening to this later on, any high availability solution should not have a single point of failure in the physical machine that it's running on. So this concept of an anti-affinity rule means it just says, hey, this VM over here should never be on the same host as this guy over here. And it could be two nodes in an FCI. It could be two replicas in availability group pair. If they're on the same physical machine and you get bad stick of memory, main board goes down, whatever, game over, your HA solution is toast and you're waiting for the VM architecture to bring at least one of them back up quick. Good luck.
and you hope it brings it back intact.
Just ha.
Yeah, I like that.
I think part of the struggle for, well, for me, I can only speak to my own experience. So part of the struggle is with trying to talk about AGs managed by DBAs and overlapping technologies, maybe managed by system administrators, is who's going to be yelled at and who's going to be held responsible when there's a problem. And for me as a DBA, if I'm the person who's going to be yelled at and held responsible for keeping a database up or a SQL Server up, like I want, then I want to use what I'm familiar with. If it's the system administrators, then okay, let's use VMware's stuff, whatever that looks like. And then when I'm waiting for things to come back up, I'm going to send you to them and say, I'll work on it when they tell me I can. It's just, are you comfortable with that or not? I don't know.
Kind of spinning the clock back a little bit here, but one of the things that I have actually done in more than one instance is I have gone in and told my boss, I understand that we now have backup administrators and they're responsible for running the backups. They are responsible for RTO and RPO measurements. I cannot do that anymore. You've taken that ability away from me. I'm okay with that, but I can't if someone else controls it. So Josh, that might be a big help for you.
It's a really good point.
There's a lot of backstory, and I know some of you have heard this story from me. It's an environment that didn't have a DBA until 2 years ago when I got there.
Yep.
And I mean, one of the first battles was we need to stop using no lock. Like you need to stop putting that hint everywhere. And these were the people that were managing the SQL Server before I got there. The second argument was we can't have a dev, test, and a prod database on the same database server, because when you go to do your test, as soon as you change the code for the new environment, you've invalidated all of your tests. So it is a huge uphill battle. So any help that anybody can say if they've been through this battle before, this is honestly, this is why I hopped on here, because I know a lot of people on here have fought these battles already. To hear some of these, to give me the ammunition is great. So again, I know I sound like a broken record, but thank you.
One other point to throw out with your comment regarding no lock, just tell them that no lock means estimate. That helps.
I like that.
Everybody on this call will laugh at this one. The financial systems manager says, oh, the reason why these queries aren't running quick is because we have no lock. 10 minutes later, after I explained to her what no lock does, the look on the face, I still to this day wish I'd have taken a picture.
Yep. Yeah. Once they understand that no lock means estimate, I don't need an exact answer. That pretty much will bring that to a screeching halt, at least for the financial folks.
Yeah.
So Brent Ozar has, and maybe you've seen him, Josh, I don't know, but this talk about no lock made me think about this. Brent Ozar has a more than one blog where he shows that estimation that Pat's talking about, and that you have no guarantee of getting the same results. So maybe if you either pointed them to those blogs, reproduced those blogs in front of them and let them ask questions, maybe that would help them realize that maybe no lock kind of not a good idea. I don't know.
The response I got was, I would rather deal with an estimate than have to worry about blocking and taking the system down.
Well, what about RCSI?
Yeah.
Right.
And I've gotten 4 of our vendors so far to let me turn it on.
Good.
I have one vendor that won't let me do it, but it's the question I ask every single time. Can we turn RCSI on? And the problem is, in the environment I'm in, our main system other than the financial system is our document management system. And that's a complex beast because it spans not only the database, but also goes to the file system. And a lot of it is, we don't do anything without talking to them because documents in our world are critical. So
Just turning SQL into Oracle mode is dangerous on the other side of the equation, because applications that are written for SQL Server, they don't expect that updates fail. While once you turn that on, updates fail all the time. Also, RCSI also turns your results into an estimate. The problem is, if, for example, I've seen places where they run like a major report that runs for 6 hours, but the report kind of assumes that somewhere in the middle, the missing data is going to inject it into some tables. When you have the snapshot isolation, that data never makes it to the report. So all the methods, if blocking is there for a reason, blocking is there to give you the correct data. If you turn it off or replace it with a different isolation level that your application is not written for, you will have funny side effects. Yeah.
Now, one thing that has helped me, because I have been faced with a few environments where no lock's been a thing, and somebody trots out a blog or something. It's like, well, this is why we use it, because this person said it was fine, or somebody who used to work here said it was fine. When I can demonstrate a query with no lock in it that is blocking other stuff, where so it's not, and they're like, it says no lock. I was like, cool, that's not always what it does. And when you can pair, okay, this says no lock, but look at what it's doing with all the downsides, that has often helped me turn the tide, because in a lot of these environments, nobody realized that it's not doing what it says, and that it really in the guts of how no lock works. And when you can prove that, like, all right, yeah, it says that, but that's not precisely what it does, and it has all these other negative impacts, that tends to get the ball rolling downhill for getting it stripped out of code.
what are you using as an example? just to begin training in one window and then hop to another one, or?
So the best thing is something that's in the workload already. And that's because, if you create a demo for it, the people that are going to be the hardest to convince are going to be like, oh, well, you just cook something up and, that's an edge case. We don't have that. So if they've got monitoring of any kind, whatever the third-party tool is or home built or something that you've rolled your own to kind of pull that out. And you can say, hey, look, this has no lock in it, and watch it block all this stuff. That's the best thing. I mean, putting together a demo, probably most of the folks here, probably anybody here could put together something, but it doesn't hit with those people. But when you're like, this is in your code and it does this, then they're like, oh man, that's bad. We should take that out. You're right. Usually.
That's why I'm hoping you brought up the monitoring point. It's literally on the books for January 1 to start working on implementing monitoring. I've got my third party coming in to do the POC because I just don't have the bandwidth for it, picking a product and going with it. And I'm hoping those results help.
Yeah, well, and that's it. Depending on how big a problem it is, that's when it can be fruitful to take your, to just basically write something, run SP who's active, even absent anything else. Like if it's in there, if you've got to put something together to log those results to a table or run it in front of somebody for 15 minutes, say like you're going to see it. Even that, like it's not pretty, it's not fancy, but it's like, look, that says no lock, but it's actually blocking these other things. And in that way, who's active can be pretty useful, and you don't have to go buy something or even write something. Like I have it on the second screen over here. Blocking session ID is like column 9. And you can just be like, watch this column. And, it's worked at places where you can tell it's in there and you just have to show somebody. But yeah, it's often in my experience, this isn't universally true, but it's often the app devs that are the best at SQL Server that put up the biggest fight about this, because they're well read enough where they're like, they have fixed database problems before, so they had credibility in the organization before you were hired or before you consulted there.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they said, well, no lock will fix this, everybody's like, oh yeah, well, they fixed that other thing, so we'll do that. So if you convince them, they'll convince everybody else. Yep.
It's a situation where no lock in that case, or always using a particular HA solution becomes the third law of practical mechanics. In time of need, anything heavy is a hammer.
Yeah.
Or you just do what Morehouse does and show up with a baseball bat.
Right.
I
think that's law 3A. Yeah.
When in doubt, baseball bat. Law 3B is when in doubt, also use wiffle bat because it doesn't leave a bigger mark. Still stings though.
Gets the point across without significant violence.
Yeah. Awesome.
More sting gets your attention, but doesn't necessarily require the need of a doctor.
Exactly. I'll interrupt here real quick. If there's anybody else that has any additional questions for this absolutely amazing panel, please drop them in the chat window now. Otherwise, you can keep laughing here for a little bit.
Well, I was going to say that just doing some basic row store index tuning is usually the first step when you're trying to eliminate blocking and locking instead of throwing no lockings on. And all of us know that, but trying to educate your devs about that and getting the indexes right. And it's going to help so many other things too by doing that. I mean, that's one of your best tools as a DBA that sometimes gets overlooked.
This is where I love to show them the effects of a couple of really good indexes on some process that they know already is a pig. Literally get on, say, hey, this process takes 2 hours to run every night. Let me show you the power of this. Click, click, click. Hey, run that again. Done. Okay, now let's do this to other things too.
First week I was at the new place, SVP says to me every day, find anything that scares you. And my response every time was, I found things that made sense at the time for the person who was doing it. And then the first month I was able to take 3 queries and knock them from 2 hours down to sub-minute and got my street cred real quick.
That helps a
So
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
it's,
and
it's the
what-
double-edged sword with SQL Server is that you can go next, finish, install, and it turns on. That's one of the problems. It's not easy to get this stuff really running, and it's even harder to keep it running. But the easy nature of this stuff makes people think that it is, I don't want to use the phrase trivial, but easy.
Right. Well, and what can pay off sometimes, and it depends on the environment and the structure. And for me, this has always worked better in mid-sized to small shops than large. But if you can, even just pull a report, pull something, if you've got Century One or something like that, go look at the 10, 15, 20 things that run the most and go find an architect, senior engineer, senior dev, whatever, and say, hey, these run a lot. Can you tell me what they do? And sometimes, and even where I'm at now, we've uncovered some big wins just doing that. It's like, well, in this time span, we saw this called a million times. What process is it in? They're like, well, it gets called when this, and this happens. But then follow on is usually like, it doesn't seem like it should be running that much. And then you go and you kind of unwind the logic. So it wasn't, we looked at it, clean plan, like we can't make it run faster. But questions are worth asking the other way too. So it's like, oh, because somebody with that kind of higher knowledge than your junior most dev is going to say, that doesn't smell right to me. We need to figure that out. So sometimes, it's cliche for sure, but sometimes the best way to tune something is to just make it do less stuff.
Our Genesis is known to say the fastest IO is the one that doesn't happen.
It's true.
Look, I literally 2 weeks ago, our solutions dev manager brought up in one of our managers meetings that he was thankful to me for introducing him to temp tables and how properly to use them. And they have made huge performance gains by just leveraging a temp table instead of the multiple joins or whatever the case may be for it. So, Matt, to your point, it's just running it less, or should it be running at all?
Well, it's the identification. I found one just a couple of weeks ago, 15 billion records in a change tracking table. They asked a very good question. What's this for? The data warehouse folks go, I don't know. We're not using that. So yeah, 500 gigs freed up yesterday, actually.
I wish I could turn change tracking off. Our data warehouse folks decided to use a product that required change tracking to take the data because the BI folks didn't want to do ETL. Go figure. They wanted to use change tracking instead. And now when I run Michael J. Schwartz, top IOs query, and I allow for, I do top 50 instead of top 20, allowing for ties, I get like 1900 and something results. And all but about 50 of them are change tracking.
And it's still only an approximation of what changed.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The data on the other side is not going to be correct in the long run. It uses an operation, a distributed transaction, without going through distributed transaction coordinator. And every time your machine crashes, dies, or does anything, there's a chance change tracking will have an error. And you will be either missing data or having data twice. And if your data warehouse relies on that, good luck.
I mean, warehouses are all just aggregated data. They don't have to be precise, right?
Yeah. Especially if you're like reporting on taxes or stuff, goes off the data warehouse.
Stuff. Just round numbers is fine. Yeah, that's good.
So who cares a billion up and down?
I think I should probably not say anymore on a publicly available recorded thing.
I can pause it.
No, I'm not trying to get fired.
Peter, I'm in the exact same boat. I feel your pain on it.
Amen.
That's okay. You do this long enough, you learn that you've never seen everything, but you can certainly say you've seen a lot.
Right. Just like
Yeah.
there's no one who is an expert in every aspect of SQL Server.
Nope.
Yeah.
But there are certainly job descriptions looking for that.
Well, they
Yes.
can-
Need experience in everything with SQL Server in the name or everything that's ever done.
Yeah, they can
And
get a
with
deep-
everything Oracle in the name, and those people are, looking for unique unicorns.
Right. And we have 50,000 whole dollars to pay you for all of that knowledge.
Oh,
Right.
yeah, they're going to
Yeah.
get somebody who's been a DBA for about 2.5 years that knows everything, and that's going to be great until it isn't.
You don't know how much you have to know in order to know how little you know.
Yeah.
First
Oh.
question on an interview. Where do you rate yourself 1 to 10 on your SQL knowledge? Anybody that goes an 8 or above at this point, I immediately, and I hate to say I write it off at that point, but to your point, you don't know what you don't. Yeah.
It's a short
hilarious.
list.
That's hilarious. I put myself at a 7 right there.
I was thinking I put myself about a 6 at best.
So here's a question for the group,
Yeah.
because I'm not consulting now, but I was for several years. And you'd have customers that were on-prem, and you'd come out either to diagnose an HA issue they had or do some sort of POC or some sort of evaluation, like, oh, we had an outage and we want to not have that. So how should we do that? And the reflexive answer for some places, even when they're paying you or me or whoever to come out and do that, is like, oh, thanks for the time, but in 18 months we're not going to be on-prem, or in 12 months we're not going to be on-prem. We're going to be in Azure, and we don't have to worry about high availability at that point. Right. So right, but then to somebody who, you watch the ads during sporting events and all that, and whether it's AWS or Azure or whatever, and you're not plugged into the outage news like probably most of us are, you just think it all works. What's the response?
My response is really simple. Let me Google this for you and type in the phrase cloud outage. That, when you start tacking on about 10 zeros to the search results there, that tells you you can't just ignore the topic. The response is, here's the SLA with the platform that they have really no obligation to exceed. So
Right.
when is this good enough?
And nothing happens if they don't make it.
Right.
You get like a month for free. If you miss the deadline and you're missing out on a multi-million-dollar contract or something, yeah, you get your email account for free for 1 month, which is $5 or something. Yeah, this giving up control to a large company taking over what you're doing. Yep, it's a possibility. Is it going to give you everything you dream of? It's going to give you. That
Right.
is a big question mark. And don't get me wrong, there's awesome use cases for the cloud.
Mhm. Yeah.
And there's awesome cases that will fail.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's yet another platform with a lot of really good tools when it's the right use case. You have to consider HA and DR as part of the overall continuity strategy. And if the SLAs in the cloud are not good enough for what you need, or if their response, if their SLAs are breached, isn't even close to what you need, you have to either augment what they're doing with something you need to do, or change what you're doing.
Yeah. Or honestly use more than one cloud. Have the primary in the shopping center and have the secondary with the software company, to not name them.
Well, so here's a good point of argument, is because I know there's diverse opinions within my Twitter timeline on that point. Is it better to go multi-cloud, or better to stay in a single cloud but be diverse regionally? Like, there's complications introduced each way, right? What is better? Because there are strong opinions both ways.
I've seen multiple regions go down at the same time. I've never seen multiple clouds go down at the same time yet. Emphasis on yet. It will happen.
This is a DNS outage, and that's what it'll be.
Always DNS. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that only affects one type of company.
To me, it goes back to what level of expertise does your organization as a whole have in managing one cloud provider? And then do they have the same level of expertise in a second cloud provider? If they do, then think about multi-cloud, maybe. It's very complex, but it eliminates more single functions of failure, so to speak. But if you don't have the management expertise to handle any one of them properly, how are you going to do two or more?
Edwin makes a great point in the chat. Your financial outlay will dictate what's better. How much budget do you have? How much is it worth to you to be multi-cloud? Are you going to pay more money to have that second cloud security than you're going to lose in any reasonably expected outage?
Mm-hmm.
That goes back to the whole argument of how much does it cost us when this particular item is down?
Yep.
What does it cost us an hour? And nobody wants to have that discussion.
But you have to have that number to be able to help really define the stuff. I mean, example, the storms that went through yesterday knocked out a really good client of theirs. It's 150,000 an hour that they're down. You know, that hurts. That hurts a lot.
Thomas will acknowledge this. Financial companies are really, really good at understanding how much they lose per hour per service being down.
Yep, could be. And also to the cloud, one cloud, two clouds, no cloud. If you have all your high availability within one cloud, at least try to have a backup outside. At least try to have a backup somewhere, because in a cloud environment, I'm not afraid that two data centers in two different regions are going to explode. I'm afraid in the cloud that someone's going to roll out some software that disconnects my service, and then they can't find it again. Yep. And then the data is gone because my account was deleted by accident or something. Yeah. These are things that can happen. Yeah.
Or you can't get to it for
or you
hours.
can get to it for
Yeah.
3 days. Yeah. And you still have your old server in the basement and you could restore it, but you don't have a copy. So even if it's another cloud, or if it's a USB stick that you carry around with you, have a copy of the data somewhere that you can get to if you're trusting just one cloud provider and they are not done. The same thing, have a copy of your emails when your email account is in the cloud or something, so that if your internet fails, your internet access fails, you still have a way of doing something.
Right. Yeah, whatever you think of Facebook as a company, from a HA nerd standpoint, like, it's pretty amazing what they had done until it all went wrong, until they all undid it. So that's
Just
a big
because you
cautionary
need
tale
DNS,
for all the stuff that you just said. Like, look at how they relied on it, to get into the building, to get into the data center, never thinking like, oh, we're going to roll out some automated process that's funky and take the whole world down that lives on this stuff for 10 hours. Right. Yeah.
DNS to open your door to get to the DNS server. Yeah. It's this funny drawings where someone sits on a tree on a branch and has a saw and is using it on the wrong side of the branch. And that's, that can happen. And if you look at outages and all that, lots of them are human made, and not like in the moment it failed. The error happened months or years before, when you made a design decision where you did not consider something. I made lots of them, and I learned over the years what not to do. I once had crossed over the power supplies. So I had a fully redundant cluster. The problem was, if one of the two power feeds failed, it switched off the network of cluster node A and the node B. And if the other power failed, it switched off switch B and node A. So regardless which power failed, the whole thing was down. 'Cause it cut off both sides, yeah. And mistake, yeah. One cable plugged into the wrong thing. That thing ran for years and probably would have run for many more years if not at some point power failed.
Right. Well,
And-
and how many, if it's not a mistake, how many of those design decisions ended with the sentence, and we'll come back and make this right later?
Oh, that too, yeah.
Oh,
No, I know this is weird, but you know, we got to get it done and we'll fix it in 3 months.
I
Yep.
think
That-
in Europe, they had for 8 years a provisional IMAX theater that was basically built out a bunch of old bleachers and the big screen. And then they finally decided we're building a real one. They built the real one, COVID hit, and they went bankrupt. So sometimes it's a good idea to not fix something that you plan
This
to.
is true.
TJ, I think you might have said it at a previous place. You don't have the time to do it right. You don't have the time to do it twice.
Yeah, that I don't remember that, but it makes a lot of sense. So might be someone else that said that.
Actually, no, I actually do remember you saying that because I was there.
Okay.
I
Yeah, I'm
do
getting
remember you
old.
saying that. No,
Oh.
no, no.
The memory is getting like. Yeah, but there's something to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was a fun Q&A session. Now, I don't know about you all. I would love to do this every 2 to 3 months and just do this in addition to the regular stream sessions because one, they're fun, they're educational, and it's just a great way to learn and laugh and just have a good quiet window. So I think we're
I'm
gonna
up
make
for it
this
because-
more of a regular thing.
I'm up for it because they require very little preparation on my end. So no hours and days of slide decks and demos. So yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. So for anybody that's watching this after the fact, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you anybody that jumped on and asked some really good questions. I am going to go ahead and end the recording now.